Today is September 24th, 2023. My name is Gina Matos, and I'm interviewing Carl Justin Knight for the Houston Asian American Archive. Thank you so much for making time to participate in this interview for us.
Oh, yeah, thank you for having me.
Of course. So we can get right into our first question. When and where were you born?
Oh, I was born in a little town called San Antonio, Zambales, back in the Philippines in April 27, 1994. My mom around that time was a single mom. She was 17 when she had given birth to me. And I remember one story that came out of that was that my doctor was a little bit ham-handed when he was delivering me. So when I was born, I practically had in my soft skull my doctor's hand that my mom just grooved back into like a really well a relatively round skull now. But yes.
Yeah, on that note, who are your parents and what were your parents' occupations? And if any way, how did it influence your upbringing?
Mm. So my mom she was a housemaker ever since I was born, and my dad he was practically my stepdad, but my dad back then was a graduate of the Philippine Military Academy. He was a military officer, and after becoming a military officer, he transferred into the Philippine Coast Guard, and then had some little like side businesses here and there, and then probably about 15 years later to 20 years later they moved here to the United States, and now my dad works as a nursing assistant for MD Anderson, and then my mom right now works as a housekeep for a very wealthy family here in Houston.
Great. So if you could just elaborate on your experience growing up in San Antonio in the Philippines, what was the neighborhood like? Do you have any specific images or memories?
Hmm. San Antonio, when I was growing up, it was just like a small farming and fishing community. Some of us actually like the whole province. We kind of call it the California of the Philippines because it's the West Coast, and it also has like everything, every natural beauty that you can think of. We have it there. And around the time when I was born, there was a U.S. naval base there, a communications base that they used for mainly the Vietnam and the Korea War. It was a communications base, so they could like easily communicate. And it was both a small town and a kind of like a tiny city because of like the amount of culture that comes in. I remember my aunts were telling me that Thriller was big in San Antonio before it got big in Manila, which is the capital of the Philippines. So all these US Navy officers would just like come and bring their music, bring the movies, and then all the people in our town. In our town, there were also a lot of people who had moved from other provinces. And for people who don't know, like the Philippines is like over 70, 80 different cultures, and just these are all just like native cultures alone. So I kind of had like a whole Home Depot swatch of the different colors of the Philippines, so it was kind of like a practice for here when I moved here. So it's like just multicultural. Like there are different ways of cooking something. There are different ways of pronouncing something or calling something. And then back when I was growing up as well, this was like just in before times. It wasn't as touristy as it is now. So I remember it just during the afternoons at like 5 or 6 in the afternoon, just before the sunset. If you look into the horizon by the beach, it's there ha they we have I think about like three islands, but you really only see two. So it's like shaped like this, and then there's a space in between where the sun sets, And sometimes there are days when it sets in the valley of one of the islands. It was so beautiful out there. I miss it. I miss it very much.
Yeah, that sounds so, so pretty.
Yeah.
Um, in your survey, you also mentioned that you have five siblings.
Yes, I do have five siblings. I'm the eldest. So the my sister Cheyenne, we call her Lalit. She was born June 10th, 97. My sister Marie, she was born January 26th, year 2000. My sister uh Gabrielle, we call her Yell just because Marie couldn't say Gabrielle back then. So we call her Yell. She was born April 4th, 2002. And then my sister Aggie, Agatha, she was born January 20th in Chicago. She was the only one who was born here. January 20th, 2010. And then my brother Liam, we call him B-Boy. He was born April 30th, 2011. I remember when I was graduating high school, my mom was so pregnant with him. He was like as big as a lemon. Yeah.
What values did your parents instill in you and your siblings growing up?
Mm. It was a little bit unconventional, I would say, because I remember when I was growing up, I would be a little bit jealous of all these like stereotypical Filipino moms and dads that would like be strict but also nurturing. My parents weren't always like that. We kind of lived in a very do it at your own pace, but also making sure that you're like in a lane where you're not actually like bothering other people. Like my dad, I think if there is any stereotype about my dad is that he is a military dad where he expects you to follow all the rules and all that stuff. And also like pretty conservative, his pretty conservative upbringing had also influenced that. So he wants us to make sure that we're focusing on studies more than anything, and you do not want to disappoint him with your grades. But luckily enough, we were all good with that. My mom, I remember when I was about like 6 or 7, we had like this like tiny conversation where, like, I can be your best friend. Like you can talk to me whatever you like. If we need to fight someone, I will fight them as well. And yeah, my mom does not feel like a mom, but in a good sense where I can be comfortable with her. She's like my oldest friend. I literally can tell her anything and we just have fun. So that's why I love about my parents. My dad, I couldn't talk to him back then, but like looking back at it now as an adult, he he was doing a lot for what he had. So while he was doing all his office stuff back in Manila, uh, one weekend he'd drive to Isabela, where he is from, and it is so so far away in the mountain regions in northern Luzon, which is the northern islands in the Philippines, because he actually is from there and he's taking care of family business over there. And then he'd spend like 2 days there driving about, I'd say, 10 hours, and that is just like for the weekend, and then come back to Manila for work for a week, and then the next weekend he'll be at our place. And the thing I was disappointed with him about when I was younger was that he did not have time to like play with us. he was uh, he was busy like taking care of the car. My dad is a big car maintenance man, which he got from his dad, who was a doctor, but his real love is fixing cars. My grandma was telling me a story a few months ago where my grandpa was a big like a repairman for cars, and one time someone had gotten it hit with a machete, And they're like, "Doc, can you please help this guy?" And then it's like, "Okay, give me a second." And it would like take him a while to like take off all the grease first before he could like operate on the guy. Because he also comes from a really small town. If you call our town a small town, that is a really small town, and he was the only doctor there. It was so funny. But yeah, my dad, yeah, he did a lot, and he was super strict, especially with me. I growing up, I also thought because it was the fact that I wasn't really his kid, because my mom my real dad had walked away from my mom when he had found out that she was pregnant with me. And I think like 3 years later they were like, they met again, and I was there, and he was like, "Is he really my son?" And since then he just never talked to my mom. I met him when I was in high school. I was like 17, I think. Uh and then we just had like a tiny talk, and that was it. But yeah, like coming back to my dad, like now he's not as strict anymore. He does still like try to guide me every now and then, but mostly it's about car maintenance. He's really good with car maintenance, like make sure your car is clean, like stuff like that. It's already 5,000 miles, you need to get your oil change, and he'll do it for me, for free. Just buy the oil, buy the filter, he'll do it for me. The same thing with the like brakes and anything that goes wrong with the car. I'm really lucky with him. And I think like right now, like my mom, he's my best friend. Like every time I come home, because I had recently moved out of their place last May, and every time I come home, we just spend like about like an hour or two just talking like the and I like when I was like probably 11 or 12, I would not imagine me and my dad talk like this. Yeah, yeah, I'm glad about my parents and the relationship I have with them now too.
For sure, that sounds super lovely. Did your family practice any Filipino traditions growing up? And if so, can you share some memories about them?
Mm, again, they're not conventional, because my mom, the reason why I have the last name Knight is because my grandfather was an American Navy, and she grew up in a Filipino American household. And my grandmother, by the way, is from Samar. She's Waray, and she's from the Visayas region. So we pretty much had kind of like a Western upbringing with a little, like hints of Filipino-ness there. Our biggest celebrations are always birthdays and Christmases, and New Year's too. So birthdays, like we'd always have spaghetti. It's a never Filipino spaghetti. It's closer to Italian actually. It's comfort food for me right now. And we'd always have hot dogs. It's pretty great, and then cake, and anything else they'd just like add to it. When I was 5, my dad had brought a printer, and it really hits me as nostalgia. But like when you print like these tiny clip arts from, and this was like 97 word, I think. It's like a pretty specific aesthetic. So he'd print that out, and then he'd say happy birthday, and then all that stuff. And then I think when my sister was born, we started hiring clowns for birthdays, and we'd kind of be famous in our block for that. Like even people we don't necessarily had invited, they would come over just to see the clowns. And I'm not really familiar with like clown culture in most places, but our clown culture, he was also a magician. So aside from being like a really funny host, he'd be doing like magic tricks that are like way out of there. Like he'd pull something out of your ear, and it's kind of like a hint of adult humor there too. It's like, adult underwear. And yeah, and so silly stuff there too. And I think we hired, it's the same clown. His name is Buyoyong. And last time I checked up with him, he's an ambulance driver, but he used to do clowning full time. And we hired him for about like 8 years until my sister decided to not have any parties anymore. We do also have the Day of the Dead. I think that's the only like Filipino tradition we practice, where we just go to the cemetery, clean up like days before, and then just hang out there the rest of the day. And since it is like sort of an American town, some people would come over there in their Halloween costumes, just like walking around too. And then like expats would come over and then just give out free Hershey bars to everyone who comes out. And then Christmas is always a big thing. It is our biggest holiday. We don't decorate as early as September as most Filipinos do. We do start decorating around I would say like the earliest we've done was like the fourth Sunday of November. And then we just start decorating. We had a tree that we had for about like 27 years until we like replaced it with something because it wouldn't fit in our living room anymore. And when I was like up to 3 years old, I think 3 or 4, I had a godfather who would dress up as Santa Claus and would come over to our place. And he was a British man, and it's like it was sort of weird to hear a Santa Claus who was British. As opposed to like the things I see on TV, just go ho ho ho, that I think those are the only things that we actually celebrate. The other things that we like me personally that I kind of celebrate is Good Friday. Good Friday in the Philippines, it's a really big event even for non-Catholics too, or I'd say non-Christians alike, because in the streets people would flagellate themselves. So they'd like carry out a really big cross, and then they would cut themselves in the back, and they would hire some people to whip them in the back with like tiny bamboo sticks, or in other places it's actually like whips. And they do this where the regular procession route would go. And when it's the last station is always the church. They would pray there for like a quick minute or two, and then they would go home, practically absolving their sins. Uh, we would just go out the streets, and there are like the actual procession route. There are stations where people just like build it out of like grass and bamboo, and then we would just like wait there. Sometimes just having some snacks, some barbecue. Sometimes, even though we're not supposed to during that time. But yes, I do remember there was this one thing I was asking when I was young, because it is a superstition in the Philippines that if you cut yourself during Good Friday, it would never, never, ever heal. And I was like, but they're cutting themselves in their backs, and there's like scores and scores of like slices in their backs. Like, well, God is good, I guess.
For sure. Along that line, how would you describe your and your family's relationship to Catholicism growing up?
Not that great, I guess. My grandfather, um, his family background was a Protestant, but he was a little bit more agnostic, I guess, just based off of his this is my maternal grandfather. It was just based off of his personal experience. His father too was his father was an alcoholic and just left home when he was like pretty young. So, and this was during the Depression era, so he had to like pick up jobs just to help out his mom. And when he was 17, I think, or 16, he tried to sign up for the Navy, and he was able to be there for a while until my great grandma was like, "Hey, he's in the base. Can you pick him up?" And then his sheriff uncle did pick him up from the base, and then they had waited until he was 18. He really wanted to get out of there, and when he came home, he really didn't practice any religion. Oh, sorry, come to the Philippines, I guess. And my grandmother was Catholic. She'd go to Sunday mass if she can when I was growing up, but towards I'd say 2010, she started to come to church regularly. So like that would be yeah, like just every day I'd see her in church. And like when I was working with the church, we'd just like often like meet up after that, and then I'd walk her as close as I can to her place because I had to go to work after mass. So and then we'd buy pandesal and coffee, and then she would go to her place and I would go straight to work. And that did not rub off to any of her children. My mom really wasn't practicing, and I think it also has to do with the fact that she grew up in a Catholic school. And according to one of my teachers, her name is Mrs. Basilio. Mrs. Basilio and my mom did not get along. uh, Mrs. Basilio would say like she is her number one enemy. So when it was my turn to go to high school, it's like, your son is the complete opposite of you during family meetings. It was so funny. But they were my mom and my dad. My dad, he'd go to Sunday mass if he can, and that is very, very rarely. But then me personally, I was influenced by my cousin, who was my best friend. He's 10 years older than me, and now he's uh he's in his process to become a priest. He's about to be ordained in I'd say like probably in a year. But he used to be like a coordinator for the altar servers, so the people who help the priest during the mass. And I thought when I was like really young, he was like the coolest person ever. He was like he basically taught me culture without intending to. So he just like he was just like really in love with the church and is just there whenever he can, and that had rubbed off on me. And I think that had brought me close to being a Catholic. That had to, like yeah, just yeah, I probably blossomed with him there thanks to the seeds that he planted actually. And after that he went into seminary and I was practically on my own. Think the closest person who is as closer to Catholicism in our family as I am is my sister Marie. Although now, like both of us, because I don't know, like Catholicism for me here in America personally is so different. I think they swing more fundamentalist than they actually are Catholic, because relatively Catholics, in my view at least, are liberal, which is my political swing at least. And also like the big thing when I was in the Philippines, there was this thing, the reproductive health bill, which actually took care of reproductive health rights for women, which I was a very big supporter of. In the Philippines, there are some Catholics where, this is actually good. And in the end, they were able to pass that law. And a lot, like over here, it's just a question of a woman's right to like choose whether to keep that or no. And it's you're worse than Satan himself if you have those views and are still with the church. Yeah, tiny things like that. Yes, that's why that's like for me personally, that's one of the reasons why I don't go to church here. But I would say in like everything I do, like I still practice them whatever Jesuits practice to seeing God and everything. Like this might be this might be a lot to take in, but is there a reason why would there be a way for me to help out? I think I could word that better, but I think I'm gonna go with that.
For sure, that makes sense. Before we move more into the education section of this interview, your first language is Filipino, while Ilocano and English are your second languages, at least what you noted down in your survey.
Mhm.
So, when and how did you learn both of your second languages?
Okay, so uh since uh since the area, there were a lot of there were a lot of people from other cultures, mainly that whole town. Sorry, let me go back a little bit. Just a tiny history thing. When that town was settled, it was settled by Ilocanos, which is like people who spoke Ilocano. And so that town is technically an Ilocano town. And then as settlers had moved in, and especially when there was like a naval base that had been built there, there were instantly like hundreds of jobs available. So a lot of people who were from Visayas or Mindanao, or even people who had signed up for the military, they had found their place there. So the lingua franca for that whole place became Filipino in Tagalog. And that's how our household had grown up in. And my grandpa, we didn't talk much. He was my best friend, but I know like some phrases at least, that my 3-year-old brain can handle. And growing up, we also had cheap HBO. So, just watching HBO. As a kid, I really loved Martin Lawrence. And then my parents, they'd really invest in VHSs. So I would watch a lot of Disney films. Um, I don't know if you've seen Prince of Egypt. That's one VHS banger. It's the Moses story, but like Mariah Carey and Whitney Houston do like the big soundtrack thing. We watch Hercules, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, all the VHSs, and that's how I would like slowly learn English. And at the same time, there's a thing where most Filipinos actually start teaching kids English first, as opposed to teaching Filipino first at home. So, oh wow, baby, can you sit up? Can you sit up? Like things like that. They do that instead of like doing that, but in Filipino. So that's how I slowly learned my English. I wasn't a big reader when I was a young kid, but um, I I was one of the faster readers, I'd say, just like skimming over things. I think that's why put me a grade, they had advanced me a grade over because of my reading skills. And Ilocano, which actually was the language of the town, I learned because whenever any adult would be angry, they'd switch to Ilocano. Like I don't know how to analyze that, but if I were to psychoanalyze that, I think it would go I think they don't want you to understand most of what they're actually trying to say. They're probably just venting out. And obviously like you do the same things over and over again, so you kind of like get the context of what those words are. And then if I can't really understand and I'm trying to understand what they're angry about, I'd ask a friend.
Thank you so much for answering all these questions about your early life. It's all so very interesting. So, moving into education, excuse me. For your primary and secondary years, you attended the T.R. Yangko Catholic Educational Institute in San Antonio. Can you tell us about your experience attending a Catholic institution in the Philippines?
That is a pretty interesting experience. Because mostly that school, uh, their main thing is being like a premier school, not only in the town but in the whole province as well. It's like pretty known that if you finish from over there and you go to colleges from different cities, like they know what kind of student you're gonna be just because you're from TR Yanko. Like I think the common thread for anyone who comes from TR Yanko is that they make leaders, which is pretty great because there is this unsaid thing about discipleship in TR Yanko where uh it's the teach them how to fish value, not just don't spoon feed them, let them figure out in their own way how to like figure this out, and that makes leaders out of most of us. And yeah, when I had started with TR Yanko, they were mostly taking care of Franciscan sisters for the longest, and they were I think like the first like actual Catholic administrators apart from the parish priest. The parish, whoever's the parish priest in that town is usually the school director. So anything that is, that has like Catholic directives, it goes through the school director. And then the school principal is the overall administrator for both the elementary and the high school department. Now, the school principal had always been a nun, and from time to time there would be someone who isn't a religious person, just a regular educator, and they they would actually have us do like once a month Catholic things, like First Friday Mass was always a thing where it had also practiced us with English, because most of these masses when we'd have them they're always in Tagalog. And then if it's the First Friday Mass, that's when they do English to try and see like whether or not we know how to respond in English. They teach us like English prayers as well. In that school, when I was before I got there, they were practicing like English days, and then that had slowly faded out. We didn't have those. Uh, the teachers were very very nice. They were uh I don't know what the word is. I think legacy, but no. But they've been there for like 20, 30 years. Some of them had taught my parents. And I think that goes the same with like everyone who had studied there. Usually it's a generational school where, like two, three generations in, because that school had been founded after the war, because most of the schools had been bomb raised. So there were a group of educators who were like, well, let's make a school. And then like ever since 1945, people in that town just just like go there. Even before it was a Catholic private school, it's just a school that you can just go to. And when I was in the fourth grade, I got I got I studied at a public school for 1 year, because my parents had it with the extra fees that come when like private education, where oh, pay for this and pay for that, and they were totally sick of that. So they sent us when I was in my fourth grade and my sister Lila was in the first grade. We were in this school called San Antonio Central Elementary School, which is the school in the heart of the town. And it was a total culture shock for me, because I think just for class reasons, I grew up with rich kids mostly. So to be around people who aren't as fortunate as you, it is totally a learning experience for me, and very humbling as well, obviously. So I think I'm very thankful for that. And also they're more competitive than we are when it comes to like school things, and because they have unbelievable goals when it comes to like testing. So yeah, I was like, after that, I was like, can we go back to TR Yanko? I was like, okay, well, we'll just finish this year then. And I graduated there. And after I graduated there, they took me in as an OJT person. And it's just fun. I think there's something about that school that works well for me. There's a certain je ne sais quoi that comes with it, but certainly magical, that school, I think, especially during the old campus years. The old campus years was, so the bottom bit of the school was made out of cement, and then the top bit of the school was just like made out of wood. So it's like a kind of like a typical building back in the 50s or in the 60s in the Philippines, where there would just be natural ventilation. You didn't need air conditioning back then. So like by the windows there would be like panels like this that would just like be open to like the breeze that comes from the vacant lot from like the next place over. Yeah, it's pretty good.
What is your earliest memory of your interest in computer science?
I actually don't have any interest in computer science, believe it or not. I just good at it, I guess, and had a good understanding of it. When I when I was in high school, I was totally in love with the idea of becoming a teacher. I really, really wanted to be a teacher. But my dad was like, no, you're not gonna have a lot of money with being a teacher. And with that brain of yours, I think it could be very, very lucrative. And then at that point, they they were gonna pay for my education, but the thing is, only if I took computer science. And I did not have the confidence in me as I did be like right now. But back then, like, how am I gonna make the money to pay to pay for all of this, and to pay for like a degree in education, and also it's going to be 4 years. Around that time when I was going to college too, we were kind of like in limbo because we needed to go here in the United States at some point, and we had to do it before I turned 21, before they had to like apply for like another document for that. And the easiest and most practical thing for me was to take a 2-year thing, which was a computer systems programming and design. And yeah, it was an associate's degree to computer science. And when me and my cousin, the same cousin that I said earlier, uh, were looking for schools, we found this school that had leased their spaces on top of a Victory Liner building, which is the main bus line. It's on top of the building, like the third and fourth floor. They were leasing over there, and I had completely liked like the place. And also, just hop off the bus, climb up, and you're there. It's pretty easy. And I sort of just breezed through it, really. And then after finishing there, the school were like, "Do you want to teach?" I was like, "Yes, please." And I think that's how I stuck with computer science. But I love computer programming logic. I hate the idea of building programs. Sometimes they overwhelm me, I guess. But yeah, like, as like, I don't know if you've had this feeling, but when you're like just like good at something, but don't necessarily have any interest in it. They're like, "Oh, you're so good at this. Let me give you this. Let me give you that. You're the only person who knows how to use a computer. Can you fix that jam that we have in the printer?" Like these things that I have necessarily no training whatsoever. It gets forced into you. And then that way, for in some capacity, you get to learn how to actually like do these things and get good at it without necessarily being like its number one fan.
For sure, for sure. Um, we're gonna touch on some of these topics that you've brought up later, but in addition to, well, I can't say now your STEM interests, they are your interests, but you pursued music later in your career. You play the keys, guitar, bass, and drums. So do you have an early memory of your interest in music?
Yes, I actually have a very good story about that one. When I was 8, I think. I think it was 8 when we had started getting a subscription for cable. And the cable in our town is like super cheap. It's like back then it was just like $10. This is the equivalent of $10. It was in pesos just 500 pesos. So with that you get HBO, you get anything that comes from Fox, get all the channels. I think there was just like 50 of them, and then there were like all the essential channels. And one of them, apart from MTV and Channel V, which is like the MTV of Asia, we also had this thing called Mix, MYX. It's a channel by the ABS-CBN Broadcasting company, and they were MTV, but with lyrics on the bottom, and that had gotten me hooked into like more music. And when I was in the second grade, I was so into Eminem and Chingy. Yeah. And then my dad saw the music video for Chingy and was like, "Nope, you're you're not watching this channel anymore." So I got relegated into his like old computer, which is like a CRT monitor kind of a PC, and he had a whole library there full of mostly guitar music. So I was like, oh, Linkin Park, who my friend was also so into Linkin Park. My friend Benedict Aquino, like, so that's how we had bonded. I found these friends who had the same musical interests as actually my dad. I was just practically his instrument. And that's how I had bonded over music with most of my friends. But the thing that had driven me most into music is when I was in the fourth grade. And my cousin, the same cousin I had talked about, Kuya Jay, he was in my room and he was listening to my mom's Sony boombox, and he had this cassette tape on that had a really good bass groove, and they were singing in Filipino. I was like, oh, this is a really interesting groove. Like, what's the name of this song? And he was like, wag mo nang itanong, which translates to don't ask about it. So I keep on asking him this until this becomes a bit for him, and this becomes a point of frustration for me because I had really, really loved that song. And then he had taught me how to operate the cassette so I can just like play to that song, which I think was the very first thing off of side B. And that song was from a band called the Eraserheads, which I actually had the pleasure of opening for them like years later. But yeah, that band had influenced me into getting into music. Like the very first CDs I had bought were the Eraserheads. And every Christmas, my dad would bring us to the closest mall to our place, and we'd have 2,000 pesos to spend, and buy anything you like. And he was a little bit disappointed that I spoiled it on Eraserheads albums. And then he was like, okay, like I think he saw like how much how much I had appreciated their music, that he was like, okay, do you want to learn how to play guitar? I was like, yes. So the same Christmas, he had brought me and my sister a locally made guitar. And as I was learning some of some chords, I was also listening to the Eraserheads. And then all my afternoons would just be a loop of this album, and I would try and learn all the parts. So when I'd go back to school and they'd have a guitar there, I'd just play everything Eraserheads. And then the keyboards, I started playing keyboards because in church, we had this Yamaha keyboard that you can pre-record stuff, but they had to be in diskettes, 32 MB diskettes. And they got so old that they got rusted. So in the middle of us singing Alleluias, it would just go Alleluia, and then it go back to Alleluia. And then I had to learn how to play keys because the person who was playing the keyboard or the organ back then, he was studying to become a teacher. and during Sundays they have reviews. So it's either we're gonna be singing a cappella, which would, it's an afternoon mass. It's gonna go so slow without the music. Or I'd be bad at it for like 4 Sundays, and then I'd just like slowly, gradually grow into it. And then someone had taught me that in keyboards or in pianos, there are also chords, and they are chords that are easier to learn as opposed to like guitar where you have to like use every finger available. Over there you could just really use three, do three, and then once you're comfortable with that, you could do the melodies with your right. And that's how I learned how to play the keys. The drums, I am a air drummer. Once I figured out that like this is the coordination for it, just like hand me sticks, I'm ready to go. And then the bass, I because of the same band, the Eraserheads, its bassist is a really funky player, and I just really love his style. So when we had like a reggae competition back in my senior year, I was like, let me play bass. Let me just play bass. And that's how I fell in love with the bass.
Super fascinating. Now we're going to move into the beginnings of your career starting in the Philippines. Um, what was your first job and your experience coming out of primary and secondary school?
My first job, I think my first official job was becoming a administration assistant. Well, administration officer, no, admissions officer. Sorry, but the thing is, because that school. Okay, here's something I don't understand about like the schooling around that time. I guess it was a franchise school, which I think is just criminal, I guess, calling a school a franchise school. um, they did not have a lot of budget when they had bought the school. So apart from me actually being hired as the admissions officer, I had a lot of slashes under my name. So apart from becoming an admissions officer, I was also um, the the administration assistant slash marketing officer slash this is another job. It's an IT staff, which means I just get to fix everything computer network related, and then slash laboratory facilitator, which meant that I did some instruction in the classroom, slash custodian. Now custodian in the Philippines just means key holder. And yeah, like in the middle of class, someone would be like, "Can I please have the keys to the lab?" Like, okay, here you go. Yeah, it was a very fun experience. And they had absorbed me into that role because when I was in my second year in college, they had noticed that, well, in my first year of college, I had um planned this event called an acquaintance party. I don't know if you all have this here, but it's the first party that all students can attend if they want to. And back then they only had about like from like 50 to 80 in attendance, and it'd be like a really small venue. And I was like, maybe let's change this whole thing and let's make it a bigger party. We had a around then a population of about 500 students, and these are all like different classes, different courses at different times. And we certainly had like a place where it was like cheap enough to hold a party, and also had everything that like the food, the sound, like all the amenities that we needed. It was at a hotel thing, but it was like pretty massive. It's called Travelers Hotel. And I'm like, okay, this is pretty big, but I think we can do it. And I had marketed to all the classrooms. So that's where I had to meet all the teachers, the instructors, all the professors. And uh I am very proud to say that I got about 380 students attend that party, as opposed to like the 80s, hundreds that they previously had. So they're like, wow, this kid is something. He's really good at marketing things. So during my second year, I did the same thing again, and we were pretty much successful. That the marketing officer on that time, Bernadette, she had asked me whether or not I wanted to probably go do some career guidance in the schools in the on the province. And the province is practically as big as I'd say the whole of Houston. So we would go to all the high schools that we can find and see, like, because career guidance also means marketing. So you get to tell them, hey, we're a school that offers all of that you need. And I was pretty good at it, that they were like, would you like to apply for it? Because we're moving her into accounting, which is her actual thing. Bernadette, I mean, because Bernadette was an accounting major, so they made her the accountant, and then they made me the admissions officer, and I was just pretty good at it. They said that, oh, like you got this budget, and go to all the schools, and the only budget that I had really was just for transportation, and that was it. No food. If something happens to me, it's all out of pocket, which sucks. But just loved meeting people and just being able to uh answer their questions like genuinely. Like, is this a thing for me? Do you like helping them make those big decisions that sometimes, not even their parents can help them with it, or they don't have like the right friend like leading them towards that way. And even though I was like the main marketing person, I wouldn't force them into enrolling into the school like other admissions officers would. They'd really force it down your throat. And my thing was like, well, I don't think we're the school for you, but I have some ideas where you could probably blossom even further. And one of the schools that I had talked to was TR Yanko, which is a pretty big homecoming thing for me. And that's how I actually transitioned into teaching over there, because the computer teacher was gonna immigrate to the I think UAE, I think. And they were like, we're in need of a computer teacher. And if you know anyone, just let me know. Or if you want to be a computer teacher, just let me know. And I was like, yes, game. And around that time, that my first job, I'm so happy I got that job, but I was only paid around 8,000 pesos, which is 200 bucks. Cost of living in San Antonio is about 180 bucks. So I barely had any savings. All just went into food and transportation. And also it didn't help that my school did not provide for, food allowances, even for my student volunteers, which kind of sucks. I was like, okay, I think for like the same amount of money without that much traveling, I think this is a more practical, and also like I think one of the best decisions I've ever made.
For sure. While working at TR Youngo from 2014 to 2015, while you were working as an educator, you were also actively involved at the Diocese of Iba as a youth leader, and you participated in the Lectors and Commentators Guild and Liturgical Youth Choir.
Mhm.
So, what inspired you to take this position as a youth leader? And were there any challenges in overseeing great amounts of people?
Uh Doing the youth leader thing, that had sprouted from me being in church all the time. It was for me, one of the reasons why I stick with the church was it was like it was actually a refuge for me. It wasn't like 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 shoved down my throat or anything. It was because as a young kid I was emotionally, physically abused, and this was my way of being free from all of that and being in an actual community that like helps you, cares for you, and like builds you up. And they had noticed that I was in the church for like longer periods of time, and then they needed a youth leader, and they saw that I had the potential for it, and I was like, okay, I'm a sign up for it. And then they had sent me. This was on a parish level, so a parish level is practically the town, and then the diocese is like the whole province. So they had sent me to a diocese meeting, and that's how I had become more involved with being a youth leader, because they would like uh have these big meetings where it's like profession it's kind of like professional development, but they're really more, they market it to you as if they were like personal development, because they the thing that they do with you is that they make sure that you're okay first, then your community, and then it spreads out. Their main thing is think big, uh go slow, start small. It's always that thing. And one of the things that I had helped planned out before I had moved here was the diocesan youth day, which involves all, like, anyone that you can consider youth. In the church, on paper, I think it's all the way up to 39 that's considered youth. So we'd invite them to like one town who wants to host it, and then we would have to find foster families for them so they could be with them for like 2 3 days, have all the consents ready, plan out the bigger events. I had actually made like a whole I made the theme song for that event. And I was like, oh, maybe I could also lead the choir around that time. But around that time as well, it was like time to go to the US. So I wasn't even in the event that I helped plan, which was sad. It was like, can we please be there? And I was like, no, you can't. The papers, darling. And yeah, and the like in between things too, like when Pope Francis had visited the Philippines, they were looking for delegates, and obviously, who else wanted to be there? So yeah, it was all about like uh that one. It was just like planning. It was like a 4 day trip. 4 day, 4 hour trips. I'm sorry, 4 hour trip to Manila, making sure everyone's okay, making sure everyone's safe. Since this is like millions of people were expected to attend, making sure that we had those plans that were in place before and after we go to Manila. The same thing with the youth day, by the way. It's like making sure that we vet all the families, that we give them, like who's gonna be the parents or the foster family, vetting them really good before we send someone from another town to spend some time with them. It Quite thankfully, in our town we always see in our province at least, we see the humor in things, where we're not like really like pissed off most of the time, but we see humor in most things. So if something does not go right, it's all gonna be fine.
That must have been so exciting. Um, so moving a little forward, would you tell us about your role as choir master at the Leo Vigildo Cantiochi Naval Station and elaborate on recruiting and working with choir volunteers?
That was a pretty interesting like sideline to like what I was already doing, because as someone who is already leading the choir in the town, I think there was this one week where the actual like volunteer choirs there, which were mostly spouses of the naval people who were based in the naval base. They were like, "Hey, can we hire your youth group to sing for us like one morning on Sunday?" And we were like, "Okay, just if you could just arrange for transportation, we'll meet at the church. If you can pick this up from there, we can go to your chapel, and we'll do it for you. And thankfully, I did have a ragtag group of kids who like really wanted to go there and experience that. So I had that, had them sign some waivers, and we went on our merry little way. And then when we were there, the community had loved the choir that we had put up. And later on, Father Eugene, who was the chapel around that time, he was like, maybe we could probably get a choir going on in the base. That way we don't have to be, like, there's always that danger there. The kids ranges were about 11 to 14, 15. So, it's a little iffy if I just had asked their parents and just, hey, can we do this every week? It's like, this is gonna be unsustainable at some point. And also, most parents, I'm afraid to say, we're helicopter parents. So it's not gonna be very sustainable. So I think, yeah, having Navy volunteers for this would be a better idea, actually, especially for y'all situation. That way, when we leave, you still have this community that you can just keep on going. So we would have practices around, I think, like 6 or 7 in the evening. I think it's like more 7 in the evening, because that's when all the recruits training would be done. And they're all, just sweaty boys and girls, just trying to beat the heat and be in the chapel. Some of them really did not want to be there, but it was close to relative comfort, I guess. But yeah, I just had everyone there for like 3 hours, 4 hours at a time. Sometimes we just rehearse like once a week, and then uh and then we'd sing Sundays. It was very, very interesting. And I think they're still doing it, but with different choir masters now. I hope they're still doing it. I haven't actually followed up on that, but my philosophy with that, I usually don't hold auditions. I think everyone can sing, and I make sure that, like, sometimes as people who teach choirs, sometimes we're just giving them the part that they're not uh it's not the best for them to sing. There's always a part for someone in choirs for me. So I did not kick anyone out from the naval choir, much to everyone's joy, actually.
That sounds like a premise for a movie, a choir of
Yeah.
choir volunteers at a naval base. Uh,
That's not a bad idea. I might probably write that for Allie.
for sure. And before we move into your immigration experience, I just had one additional question. You played the lead role of the Culo. What was your experience playing this role, and did you have a passion for performing and or acting specifically beforehand?
I've always, like everyone else, like everyone has like this tiny thing where, oh, I could probably do a role. And mine was not Jesus. I played Jesus for about like 2 years for this production of the whole passion story. They call it the Cenaculo. Cenaculo comes from the word cenacle, which means the upper room where the Last Supper was held. And before I did this role, my cousin, who again, my cousin Jay, had also taken up this role for like 3, 4 years, I think, before he had passed it on. And at that time we were holding auditions, but no one was holding up, and they were like, "You have a mustache." It's like, I think you can build off of that. And then yes, it actually had worked out well. And we had some what do you call them, improv classes. We did mostly improv classes that weren't necessarily comedic. They were just like improv and acting classes held by this guy who was also with the big television network for a while before he went into like community theater. And then the thing with me is that I suck at memorizing lines. I really do. Which is funny too, because when I was in high school, I was the big orator of the school. Like they'd send me out to like perform all these pieces and like perform all these speeches and poems and all that stuff. But the biggest struggle with me is memorizing lines. But quite thankfully, because it was an open space and we were expecting about 300 people to come. It was a one night only event for every year. And my our voices wouldn't carry if we had done it without microphones or anything. So the producer was like, well, maybe we could just pre-record all your lines and then you could just lip sync them. And we were like, yes. Yeah, so we did this for about 2 years. And one funny thing about that production, the second one, so in the Jesus story, after he dies, like one of the Roman soldiers, uh, would poke him on the side, and as the story goes, like blood would go out, and then water would come after, and this would practically say that Jesus was divine. He was both like human and God, you know. And before I had taken my final breath on stage, one of the soldiers was like super excited as I was looking up. He had poked me on the side, which prompted me to be like, like actually die from the spear wound as opposed to just die from being tired, I guess. Yeah, that was fun. I always consider myself as an okay actor, I'd say. Uh would I do it again? Probably, but I won't do a lead role anymore. I was a bad lead lead actor. I would always come to call times late. No problem for the director because he knew I'd be on my I'd be on my lines right. I'd do everything right. It would suck for everyone else because you know they're there at 8 p.m. and they're already like dressed up and all that stuff, and I'm just running there all sweaty. And it's like, okay, what do you want me? I said, okay, big movie star, you know. But yes, I think I could still do some stage time, but it's not in the big list of priorities right now.
Yeah, theater is always a crazy experience. I believe everyone should do at least once, but I mean, it's for some people and not for others. But
Yeah.
that sounds like such a fun experience. So, moving on to the next section, your immigration experience. So, in 2015, fairly recently, you moved from the Philippines to Houston. What were your reasons for moving and moving to Houston specifically?
I think the whole move was just inspired by practicality. When I was younger, we always had the plan of moving here, just like taking advantage of the fact that since my mother was already an American citizen, well, probably we should just like there's a chance for us, a very good chance for us to move here, and a pretty high chance that we'll be approved for immigration. And so we did. So I think when I was in the second grade or third grade, we got approved, but we didn't really do anything about it. We were approved one more time when we had tried again, and we didn't do anything about it. And then came to a point where I was turning 21, and they were like, okay, now or never. So we had booked all the tickets, and it was supposed to be like a whole family thing. Uh, but the thing was, when we had noticed that when we were approved for the visa, mine expired uh earlier than my sister's were. So the tickets were bought for May 12th, I think. Mine expired on April 26th because the next day I would turn 21. So they were like, okay, there goes all your goodbye parties. We gotta book this real fast, and so we did. And around that time, Houston was already home to my aunt. It was my aunt Gina who was my dad's sister. So Tita Gina already had lived here for since 97, and she works as a nurse. She's still a nurse now at Michael DeBakey at the Veterans Hospital, and she had chosen this spot. Her main thing was because it was the most practical thing, low cost of living, and then she had convinced my other my brother's my dad's brother Edwin to move here too. And then later on, they had taken my grandfather and my grandmother to live here. And then later on, they convinced my dad to move here. And we just moved here just because like family is already here mainly. And also just cost of living. As a family of eight, I think it'd be very helpful to find a city that already had a low cost of living. So yeah, it was quite an experience. It's quite a weird experience coming here too. By yourself, by the way, because prior to then I did not I w- I had never flown a plane. Flown in a plane, ridden a plane, I should say. And like my first stop was China. It was a little bit hard for me for people to not understand as I was trying to say. And then 8 hours later, coming to Houston, it was I thought I was ready for it. Mainly because like, oh, he's the most Americanized one in the bunch. But no, it's just totally different. I always thought of Houston, like, specifically Houston, as like a cleaner Manila, because you still have all these Spanish, like I would say Hispanic influences in like all the in the style of the buildings here, on the people. It's still like practically the same amount of heat that we do. Just San Antonio was just a little less humid, you know. And then just food, the people that you meet here, it's practically the same. What sucks is that everyone thinks I was so young because I was quite skinny back then when I had first moved here. At one time at a Foodorama by 59 in Belfort, I was stopped by an old lady and she was just haranguing me like, "Aren't you supposed to be in school?" Like, no, lady, I've done my time.
In the Philippines, what is the general attitude on moving to America?
It is the biggest goal. I think a lot of people's dreams get crushed when they don't get approved for anything. So they would, in like a better for the lack of term is they're practically straightening themselves up just so they can get the opportunity of going here, just even just visiting at least. Because as sad as it is, people still think that this is the promised land and not the Philippines. You see, and they try and try. I do remember um my friend who I had worked with in college, their family had been trying for years and years and years. And then after both of his parents died, the decision had just come and they were declined for it. So it's there are a lot of like sad stories about that, and some are just like extremely lucky. And but yeah, like everyone's main goal, if they can, they'd go out of the Philippines because for some people there really is nothing there for them. They find their calling in like some place like the UAE or any of the Middle Eastern countries where there's like jobs aplenty. It's either that or they move to Japan, and mainly they take on entertainer jobs, which is like just like singing, dancing. It's quite lucrative. Even if they go to Hong Kong as well. but to some people, they're like house help. Uh, they make for cheaper construction employees, which is sad actually. And yeah, like anything that is anything that it's a job and it's 10 times bigger than that what they make in the Philippines. Oh, they'd totally go for that. Yeah.
Did you experience any major culture shock when you arrived?
Uh, not not a lot, quite thankfully. I was a little bit informed of like injustices and all the stuff that comes with it through surprisingly late night comedy. There's this channel in the Philippines called Jack TV that just had everything. It's weird, that channel, by the way, because I wouldn't think of anyone who would be comedy aficionados. But if you were a comedy aficionado here in the US, that is Valhalla. It's just everything that is good about comedy, something that is like all the late night shows, even something as a deep cut as Dave Attell's Insomnia, they have it there. And most of these comedians, quite thankfully, are liberal. So the content that they would produce is something that actually looks into like it's small things such as racism or poverty, making them pretty digestible to me, as opposed to like seeing the actual viscera of it. So when I came here, I had I had the idea of what was going on here, but there would be times when I would still be shocked at the amount of like stuff that y'all are still dealing here. Y'all are still dealing with here that we like. I wish it was better. So that's simple stuff like that. But like food wise, oh my God, Houston is a haven for any kind of food that you would think of. Like there's a if you wanted like a good Jamaican place, there's a good Jamaican place, something Mongolian barbecue. There's just name it, we have it. That's the best thing about Houston when it comes to food. And then I also can't believe of the amount of like it's something as simple as like seeing like big things like the Rockets or the Lakers if they play in like one stadium. They're relatively affordable, and these are world stars. Like I could never imagine seeing like a game like that. When these are like yeah, like really big things that you think like you can't achieve, but I think that's what the American dream is about. Like to an outsider looking in, I guess. It's just they're within reach. You just have to like make a way to them. And like also me playing for my heroes, I guess. That's the biggest thing. Of all places here in Houston. So that was fun. And I think one thing that had always encountered was the fact that people think I'm young. People think I'm so young, or especially when I don't have my facial hair on. Uh, Last month, actually this was last month, we had went to Ninfa's in navigation, me and my partner, and this is just relatively after just fresh off of the cut. So we went there for lunch. They had asked for my ID, but not hers. We were just grabbing mimosas. That, and also I get stopped a lot, and then people ask me for my from what culture I'm from. Like, what are you? I think is like one of the biggest questions that the most questions I've actually answered. They could be as well as are you Mongolian? Mostly it's, are you Vietnamese? People speak to me in Spanish and say, like say these things without asking me if I know how to speak Spanish first. Yeah, it's like it's pretty interesting. And this also comes back to when I was in the Philippines, people thought I was an outsider. because A, my last name, and B, I just look different, and then it's also the same experience here. So I kind of like see what most Filipino Americans, or even other culture dash Americans feel like. uh but to me it's like my whole life, I guess, in both countries that I am from and went to. It's such a weird experience. Other good. Yeah, top of my head right now, I couldn't think of like other things, but I might just like shout them in the middle of the interview.
Go right ahead. We're gonna touch more on this later, regarding your involvement with the Filipino community in Houston. But
Yeah.
immediately after moving here, did you find any Filipino community, and or did you find it important to find it?
Initially, no. I had no big desire, at least. I had no big desire to find the Filipino community here, because my big thinking when I was here is like, if you're in this place, you gotta learn other cultures if you can. Because if I'm just looking for a piece of home, I've already had that for 20 years. I think I'm already good with learning as much as I can with the Filipinos, at least around that time. And then uh, I think it was only like 5 years later when I had started playing music here more. Uh, the vocalist for our band, um, she was with the FYP, Filipino Young Professionals, and she was the president of it. And she was like, "Oh, you should come to like an event that you might totally like." And I was like, "Oh, okay," and never actually go through with it. But yeah, like beginning back then, I didn't have the need for it, at least, because our when we had moved, our family just became a closer knit family. I had never felt this close to my sisters or my parents, like at any point in my life, as like this, because I feel like this had really tested us as a family, like how, like, what kind of a unit are we? And I think like I already have a piece of home with me at home, which I'm like quite thankful for. So yeah, community wasn't really a big thing for me. I was also just like finding my own voice as well as a person, because was just like all around these people all the time. I needed to be me, find my own voice, find my own interests, as opposed to like, oh, this is your interest. Let me get into that too. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So moving into our last section before our conclusion questions, just about all your different career and community involvements in Houston. Um, so you've worked multiple jobs in Houston. What was your experience at your first job in the States?
I feel like I was doing too much. I came from a work ethic where you have to really go above and beyond. And it doesn't matter like how much they pay you for it. Uh, so, if I can work it, I'll work it. Here's the toxic thing. If I'm sick, if I can stand up, I'll work, which is still a thing that I'm trying to shake off. It was It's quite weird because it was Starbucks and that was my first job here, and I couldn't find like an actual job till like after 6 months of staying here. I was like quite thankful I had that job. People were great. Sometimes since they haven't had their cup of coffee, they could be very, very harsh. So I had to like emotionally, like, I did not feel I was emotionally equipped for that. The amount of instant verbal abuse. Uh, yeah, it was quite hard, and I was only being paid like $8 an hour around that time, when everyone else as a barista would be like, they get paid more than this. And then just through conversations, I found that everyone else was being paid more than I was. And I was like, I do more work than you. And this is just like coming from my own voice, you know. It just it sucked. But I think just coming from my values coming into it, I still loved it. Is and I did not have the vocabulary for it then, but like right now looking back at it, it was toxic. But did I have fun? Oh boy, did I. Yeah.
After that, you worked as a medical records bookmarker and veteran evaluation services. Did you pursue the medical field or the VA for any specific reason? And what was your experience working with veterans in particular?
So that job was actually referred to me by a former shift supervisor that I had. So that company, in just like small circles, like people are either there because they're musicians or they're baristas, because they are all mostly referrals. And my friend had referred me to apply for that position. It was good for me because it was just a desk job, you know. And uh seeing as like I don't know, as an immigrant coming here, most of the people who I see who are panhandling, they just say they're Vietnam vets. And I was like, this sucks. You know, whether or not that's true or not, the fact of the matter that we can stereotype that and write that into a stereotype, you know, that's not a thing. That shouldn't be a thing. So I was like, maybe I could help out veterans in this case. And that job was if they applied for a knee thing, like they have problems with their knee regarding uh whether or not it was their fault or someone else's fault, we'd have to look up all their medical records from page 1 to page 3000 and check out anything that says knee, and then we'd pass that on to other people, to the next department, to see whether or not this is a claim that they could, you know, they could have a claim for it, the medical claims for it. That was a fun job. I was sad a lot, but around that time I did not appreciate work that is sitting down. I'm uh I'm too easily distracted. But yeah, that was fun. You only had to do like 10,000 pages a day. That was the quota. But if you can do more, you can do more. If you wanted to do weekends, and I appreciated that. But around the time my heart also wasn't not my heart, but my circumstance actually, because around that time when I was supposed to be at work, I was still driving my mother. She I was also severely depressed around that time, which had you know, my I could have performed better, I guess, looking back at it. But yes, it was quite a thing as a job to do this job there.
Thank you for sharing. And following working for the VA, and to my knowledge, up to present day, correct me if I'm wrong, you worked as a self-employed attendant and assisted parents of children with disabilities. What made you want to work self-employed, and can you share more about this experience in particular?
Oh, so that one, um, so my cousin, this is actually my cousin. My cousin has cerebral palsy, and he needs a walker to walk around. And around the time that I was unemployed, this is a really low point for me because my grandmother had also died around that time. I received a phone call from my aunt, my Tita Christine, and this is my Tito Edwin's wife. He was like, "Hey, would you like to take care of Jonathan?" And Jonathan, who's my cousin, he had really taken a liking for me. And it's like, okay, I could probably do that. Back then, it was under a company, and the thing was, his particular circumstance had made it had made that benefit unavailable for him when they had changed the rules. So they were like, okay, we'll just pay you the same amount that you've been earning with that. in that company. He can just stay here with us and like help us like get him off the bus. Just make practically the idea is babysitting. So while they're still working on their things, like do like errands, if they have to stay at work and do overtime, at least they can easily do that without worrying about taking care of Jonathan. Yeah, and I've been doing that all the way up till today, and I think that is the longest job I've ever had.
Thank you for sharing. Sorry if it seems like I'm skipping around a lot. You just have so many different things that you have been involved in, so I'm trying to hit all of them in the time
Yeah,
we have left. But if you need to slow down or if you want to elaborate on one later, then feel free to let me know. Um, and so also since 2014, even in the Philippines to now, you've also worked as a freelance musician. You've brought this up throughout the interview. You've opened and sessioned for several artists. So can you share with us your experience with music and the genre of music that you specifically like to work with?
I usually do alternative stuff. Like guitar-based music is mainly my thing. I started out playing here, started playing music here as a keyboardist, and then they found out I wasn't that great at it as a good fill-in, but yeah, I started playing guitar music, and then they saw that I had good stage energy, and people had started hiring me for their other stuff. So when like a big Filipino artist comes to town, they would hire me to play guitars or bass or anything that they need for their tour. I sometimes would be hired as a backup musician, so just in case their actual hired musician can't play. So I'd also learn those parts. Like I think my the biggest thing under my belt is I got to open for 3/4 of the Eraserheads, which is pretty great. They're often called as the Beatles of the Philippines. They're the reason why there is a big music scene in the Philippines. In in a scene where it was mostly balladeers, they were like the guitar band that just had broken through that. It was just amazing opening for them. All three of them, and then also all other indie artists. If you if you had heard the Black Eyed Peas song Bebot, or it's played at every Filipino event. But yes, that and the Apple song, because one of the artists there is Filipino, Apple the app. They had sampled two songs from this band called Asin, and I had the opportunity to play guitar for the guy who had written that, and that was also amazing. Also, there's a lot of wisdom that he just like gives out as he plays too. So it's just awesome. And then just like sometimes getting pulled because they know I'm a musician. So like I'm in the audience, he's like watching the thing. He's like, "Hey, play guitar." And then, I don't play lead guitar very well, but apparently I'm okay on stage. That's a fun thing as a musician to experience.
What would you say are the differences between the music scenes in Houston and where you were living at in the Philippines?
In the Philippines, it was more perfectionist. Like audiences will eat you alive if you call yourself a cover band and don't play as if you're playing like the actual track. It really has to be like on point. And over here, the younger Filipino musicians here, they're more a jam type kind of. They're more just jam, like whatever you feel like playing. If you don't play it well, it's okay. Like that's what's in your heart. They're a little bit more looser now than they are in the Philippines, and it's it's just fun that you can just play one song for the next 12 minutes just, please yourselves. As opposed to like a crowd in the Philippines that, they just, is you have to be like the actual track. And one thing I do notice, as opposed to like the Filipino scene in general, whether or not it be here in Houston or the Philippines, they're a sit down kind of crowd. They like sitting down during concerts. So when I go to like one my first concerts here, everyone was just sat up. My knees are tired, friend. It's like, really 4 more hours of this? It's like, yeah. So that was a quite a experience. But here, like if it's like a dance party, I want to stand up and dance. I can't because everyone prefers just to sit down, have a beer, have some food, and just enjoy the show. And since the Philippines is also a big karaoke country, they love singing along, especially if it's their favorite song. They would sometimes sing louder than you would. And my experiences as a musician at Jerry's Grill, sometimes they just like grab the mic from you. Not because you sing it bad, but just because out of pure joy. They just want to sing What's Up by Four Non Blondes.
That sounds awesome. So currently, in addition to also your freelancing work in music, you work as a youth outreach director and risk management director of Filipino Young Professionals.
Mhm.
What inspired you to take this role, and what is your experience like?
Coming back to that story about my friend Stella, who had been the president, she had pulled me into one of the events, uh, thinking that she was gonna be there. I had the very severe social anxiety back then, and I couldn't find her there. They had this thing called Meet and Eat, which it's just a small gathering, and someone had presented a thing about the Filipino immigration story. Her name is Ate Pinky. She had just like recently released a book about Filipino stories, and she was like practically doing like the prototype of it at that event. And all the members had just like talked me into like, oh, probably you can join us dancing. I love performing Filipino dances. Like I do them all the time if anyone would invite me. And so I did. I joined that, and then someone had tried to invite me to the Dragon Boat team, and I was like, I think that's for someone else. And during my time with the cultural ambassadors, which is the dance group of the nonprofit, they were telling me, hey, we need this person to be in charge of the youth outreach, which takes care of the scholarships for our group. And I was like, okay, let me try my shot at it. And when I was being trained, I was like shown like, oh, like it's not only just a networking group, it's like an actual group that does things. It's community organizing. So I I had looked for kids with Filipino ancestry or kids who do things for Filipino organizations, not necessarily being Filipino themselves, offer the scholarships to them and like guide them through the process, and then just make sure that they submit their documents on time. And I did that for a couple of years, and then right now I'm actually the risk management director. uh, i I take the back seat and watch everyone work, and then just slap their wrists if it's something that is deemed, like might pose as a legal problem or something that is far away from our mission and vision goals. And also, you're spending too much. Slap.
You also currently work as an HEB overnight coverage lead in Stalker. Does working an overnight job allow you the time to pursue all your interests, or is it sometimes a hindrance to your
it
work lifestyle?
it is the biggest hindrance. I think, because since everyone operates on the daytime, if I do like social stuff or any errands, I just have one brain cell in the daytime. Although I do have insomnia, sometimes if you need all those mental faculties, you can't. I think I did two or three job interviews badly. Don't tell my boss, but I did the three interviews that I felt that I could have done just better just by having enough sleep. And I can't take that back, but it really is a big hindrance. And mostly as an overnight person and someone who loves going to concerts, like if Mitski comes in on a Wednesday and I have to work on a Wednesday, I have to use a day off, a paid time off, just so I can still cover all my expenses and also enjoy Mitski. But the problem is like my love of concerts, all of that, if you compound all of that, that's all my paid time off. And I never really have time to go on vacation. Like, as like most people would go out of town for like a week or two, I can't because I don't have the paid time off for it. I just use it all off on concerts. It sucks. Or when there are like social events that happen at 7 and then they might go as late as 11 or 12. I have to leave at 9 just so I can get to the store at 10. It sucks because at around 9, that's just when the party's cooking. And just leaving in the heat of it. So yeah, it certainly has been a big hindrance. And also I was planning on releasing some music last spring. The amount of time that I had for creativity was just spent on resting. It certainly kills you creatively too, working an overnight job.
That totally makes sense. Um, Moving into the next question. Since 2021, you have helped organize the Houston Filipino Street Festival. How does the Houston Filipino community compare with Filipinos back in your country?
It's quite interesting because Filipinos there, they're more uh I think to better put it, I think Filipinos here are more enthusiastic of things like this as opposed to Filipinos over there. So if I put out a festival over there, sometimes if they have the time, they'll just go. Some people over here, they would actually make calendar entries for it, which is also, not a Filipino thing to do calendar entries. You just show up when you can if you remember. And but working a festival here, you also have to be mindful about everyone's emotional and personal needs, or like you have to see it in their context as well. Because not only are we catering to like Filipinos who immigrated here, we're also dealing with kids who had grown up as Filipino Americans in a household that they don't necessarily have that good generational relationship with their parents, and are finding their own Filipino roots and sometimes have a struggle with it. So we do take that into consideration when we're planning things like this. So like something like poetry, which is a little bit undervalued in the Philippines. It's still criminally undervalued over here. However, there is a community that appreciates that. We incorporate that. There's like dances that people rarely see, that I'm glad that the Filipino young professionals just like just bring home to people who can't see it. It's quite interesting, the Filipino community, prepping things for the Filipino community here. And they're not as hot-headed, I should add that. If there's one thing that Filipinos are known for, it's their temper. Over here, they're more chill. And I think that's also a Houston thing added to that.
I know you mentioned this earlier in regards to the sort of Filipino work ethic that you mentioned bringing over to America. Um, how do you balance all these activities, your work, artistic and community involvement activities. Um, would you say you're successful at or enjoy multitasking and keeping busy? And you've mentioned a little bit of this in this interview, but do you experience burnout?
I do experience burnout from time to time, but I do love being busy, like doing things like left and right if I can, because I do have this terrible thing where if I'm just at home, I don't do anything. I'm just sat and just like passed out, and sometimes it's not I'm tired kind of thing. Sometimes I just don't know what to do with myself and I'm just alone. I'm like too bored to watch something, too bored to to read something. Sometimes I just want to do other things. It's pretty great. I love keeping myself busy. Some people say, "Well, how do you do it?" I The thing for me is I just do. Like if my heart is in it, I will put my 100% in it. Although just recently, I do have a friend who, for years, has been telling me maybe you should appreciate what rest is, and ever since then, I had been like taking a step back and making sure that I'm breathing before I just run into the daily grind. And now I really appreciate that Talking Heads song, "Home is where I want to be," I think. And like right now, I'm just like more homebound than I am like going outside.
Along that line, how did the COVID-19 pandemic affect your lines of work and your experience?
Apart from uh nothing musical going on, which had sucked for me. Uh, it was just like I think like for me as a grocery worker, it's just like life just went on. I'm just wearing a mask, and since I didn't have anything else, like the FYP thing, we just did virtual checkups and stuff, and there was nothing social to do. Like all of my energies from doing the other things were transferred into this one job that uh it was hell. Especially everyone needing toilet paper and all the flu stuff. It was crazy. I would akin this would be akin to that scene. I don't know if you watch Game of Thrones, but there is a scene there where uh they were fighting this uh army of the undead, and they were just like waiting for them to come, and they just come. And this was like 6 o'clock in the morning. And back then, before but the pandemic, there would only be like 2 or 3 people just like buying some stuff. It would be a swarm of hundreds of people that would come in. And this was in the beginning of the pandemic, where everyone's just looking for alcohol, masks that we had, but we just like often run out because people would just like stock up on it. And it was pretty stressful, like doing all of that. But like the thing I missed the most, I guess, was just playing music during COVID, because I that is my free therapy. you know and yeah, I think just emotionally, yeah, I was just like I feel a little bit emotionally checked out because of that, because I couldn't like express myself in the way that I wanted to express myself. I just had to be, the very good overnight stalker. And yeah, it was a killer for me emotionally.
For sure, I could see how that would be very debilitating for you, especially concerning you and your interests. That's totally understandable. This is the last question before we get to our conclusion questions for this interview. Um, you currently reside in Sugarland. How is living in Sugarland?
No, oh, actually, I had moved closer to I'm by Minute Maid now. I had moved. This is
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah, but I used to live in Sugarland, and I'm sorry, can you repeat the question for me? Like,
Oh, it was me just asking your experience living in Sugarland and the area.
it was very good. I love that my parents' home was just the accessibility of it was by Highway 6, and we were 30 minutes to everything. And when I say 30 minutes to everything, I mean everything, even our like to me, my friends' places is just like a 30-minute drive to everything. I love that it's a pretty quiet neighborhood. Nothing much going on, but it's not like a small town where you have to like go out of your way to like have some essentials. Like everything was just like excuse me, like a 5-minute drive to like groceries and all the essentials. Uh Food, however, there's a few interesting places, but if you if you have to go, you have to go like closer to Westheimer, I guess, which is for me, personally, if you go above West Park Drive, I think that's a lot of effort.
Great. Thank you for answering all these questions. So yeah, like mentioned, we're getting into your conclusion questions now. How do you identify ethnically? Would you identify as Filipino or Filipino American? And do you have a reasoning for your decision?
I think mostly it's Filipino because I mostly identify as Filipino because I still see everything through the eyes of an outsider. Although I do have the understanding of what I would call Filipino Americans or the people who have grown up here, like see the world, and I have the understanding of it. I just sometimes feel like I still don't belong in most circles, I guess, in that sense. And also just building up on 20 years of uh growing up in the Philippines, I guess.
Makes sense. What are your hopes for the future of the Filipino and or Filipino American communities in Houston or further in the States?
I hope that here in Houston that like whatever groups we have now that foster to Filipino Americans, especially those who have a struggle with identity. Like I wish that people know about these things and that there are communities. Like you just have to reach out. The first step is just to reach out. For Filipinos everywhere, uh hmm, I guess like for Filipinos back home, I would say I hope that there is people are being better informed, and I hope they're making decisions based off of what is important to them, not as opposed to things that are trending. Like if they think that it's just like political choices, I guess, is what I'm aiming at. Sometimes they're just taken up by the fervor of it all, as opposed to, hey, this is the decision that makes much more sense.
What do you like most about working with people and specifically even younger people?
Curiosity. I think if something challenges like my day-to-day thing, if something that is like out of my daily grind, I find very interesting. Especially if it's something that shakes my beliefs or something that shakes like how I perceive something. So like I love talking to young people because they can be quite funny, like seeing the world through their lens. And sometimes you think like you're an adult sometimes, and then like seeing them find their way, and then you seeing how they find their way and apply that to you, it results in a pretty interesting stuff.
And what do you want to be remembered for?
It's a very tough question actually. I think I want to be remembered for being the best cheerleader, I guess. Sometimes I am on the spotlight, but sometimes I just prefer to be the person shining the light on people, or just like doing stuff for other people. I always go out of my way if someone needs help, whether or not I'm close to them. And I might also add sometimes even though it is unwanted. But in a funny way.
That was my last question. Thank you for such a great answer. Is there anything that you would like to share that we haven't covered yet?
Hmm. Have I? No, not on my sticky notes, I guess. But yeah, unless you have other follow-up questions.
Nope, that's all the questions I have. So thank you so much for giving such comprehensive and really rich answers. Um, Truly, it's such a pleasure interviewing you. And I think you are probably everyone's best cheerleader. And so I think you're definitely on the way to meeting that goal, or you've already reached it. So thank you for all that you do and for doing this interview.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
For sure.